We have a special guest for today, CCP Ghost, who is a senior strategist that works for CCP, I guess, for better known as the game like EVE Online, right? So what is like your involvement with EVE? How did you get started? What do you do there?
So I'm a strategist for the company, and I lead the analytical department along with along with another guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you could say my job is to try to figure out what are smart ways for us to uh, invest in and move forward. So I do a lot of analytical work for the company, and I try to understand this massively complex machine that is EVE Online, which is definitely a challenge. But that's one of the things I like about my job, is that it is really challenging. And I got involved with the company about 3.5 years ago when Hilmar, our CEO, he approached me and basically said that if I would join his company, he would give me access to the world's most interesting behavioral data set, which is 15 years of behavioral data from the socioeconomic system of EVE Online.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically did it for me. I've always been really, really interested in human behavior, psychology, all of that stuff. And so Hilmar kind of headhunted me out of my previous job, which was I was leading investigations for the Special Prosecutor's Office in Iceland, which was set up to investigate the a financial crisis that shook Iceland in 2008, when we basically lost all of our major banks in 1 week.
So your background is not gaming at all, but you were part of that special counsel that was involved in those investigations. In terms of like all the types of data sets that you could have available to you, whether it's like consumer behavior related to bank stuff or trading stuff or any other type of behavior model, why Eve, I guess?
So, I mean, if we start at the beginning, when I did my training, which I actually did it in the U.S., I got a bachelor degree in something called Security and Intelligence Studies,
Mm-hmm.
and the training there, which was basically these were all ex CIA professors that were sort of leading this study, and they were always talking about, like, the key thing to understand complex human systems is two things. You need to understand the human incentives in the system, and the second thing is you need to find the 20% that move the 80%. This is something that I have felt to be extremely true when you're analyzing complex systems. You need to really, really take your time to prep, to try to figure out where the 20% that move the 80%, so you don't waste your time on the rest. Because in my experience, there is always a 20% that move the 80%, whether that be the 20% of the players that control the economy, the 20% of the players that are controlling the wars, or the 20% of whatever it is moving the other 80%. And the second thing is understanding human incentives. If a system like the Icelandic banking system or the international banking system produces an outcome that is weird, like in the 2008 thing that started the international financial crisis, which was the subprime mortgage debacle. I don't know how familiar you are with that, or how deep you want me to go into that.
Yeah,
This,
go.
but
Hey, go as
basically,
deep as you want. I'm really familiar with it on the U.S. side of things. I don't know much about it on the Icelandic side of things.
all right. So, I mean, you're kind of touching on
Mm-hmm.
my deep nerd
Yeah,
with
go hard
this.
on it. Go real hard. My
Yeah.
understanding,
So
basically, in the U.S., the problem was we had financial institutions that connected international investors into pools of investments that were tied into risky mortgages. And then because of how interconnected all of that was, when the mortgages went down, it took down like investment people like all around the world. Like it impacted everybody because of that connection. That's my understanding of like the U.S. side of it. What was going on with the Icelandic side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to elaborate a little bit more on that, because what had happened is that healthy incentives had been basically disentangled. So they took mortgage loans, which had always had a triple A lending or credit score,
Mm-hmm.
and they rebundled them into these subprime mortgage packages, which they then resold to insurance companies and banks, because then they had a triple A rating, which is means that a insurance company that can only invest in triple A rated products, they could then get a lot of these investment vehicles. But what happened is that they, at the floor, at the ground level, in the local banks that were making these loans, that were actually lending to people who were actually buying houses, they all of a sudden had this weird incentive to lend more, because it all of a sudden wasn't their job to make sure the loan was paid, because that was now uh, somebody else's problem. So their incentive all of a sudden becomes, I need to loan out as much money as I can, because then I can sell those loans to these investment vehicles, which meant that all of a sudden in many states across the US, particularly states like Florida, which were really badly hit,
Mm-hmm.
some average Joe with really low income all of a sudden could get a mortgage loan to buy, in entire apartment buildings. The most ridiculous story I heard was when a Mexican immigrant who was a cleaning lady, she had uh, bought 11 apartment buildings with subprime, with loans, because basically the incentive was broken.
Yeah, in the
And this,
U.S., this was we call these Nina loans. So you had no income verification, no asset verification. You could
yeah,
walk into a bank, yeah, because the incentives for the bank, they didn't care if the loan went under or not. They just packaged it and sold it downstream. Yeah.
absolutely. And so the fallout from this, so when this system crumbles, when the top layer in the chain realizes, okay, actually these aren't AAA rated products, because they have been loaning these to people who probably aren't going to be able to pay them back.
Mm-hmm.
That caused like a domino effect, where people are like, okay, these are actually not as valuable as we thought. We're going to need to deprioritize them or de-risk them, or and that caused a domino effect, which led to credit in international markets to dry up really, really fast. And this is what the Icelandic banking system had, to a degree, been sort of using to fuel its growth abroad. So at the time, we had three major Icelandic banks, which were all international, and the scope of them was that they had become 14 times the size of our economy combined. And these three banks all collapsed
Was
within the
this
face of a week.
was all of this growth like what did you say, precipitated by the crash? Like, was it like in the 10 years leading up, these all grow massively because they were making money off of these types of loans, or were they were just huge banks because they'd always been huge compared to the size of your economy?
No, they had grown tremendously. Like they had doubled in size every few months
Oh,
for a
okay,
few years,
gotcha.
and one of the main reasons for that was that they had access to really cheap international credit.
Gotcha.
And when that credit dried up due to the subprime mortgage loan crisis that started in the US, our banks, specifically two out of our three banks, were so massively leveraged that
Yeah.
they just crashed almost
Okay.
immediately, and kind of took down the third bank with them. And so what came out of that is that the Icelandic government, I mean, people were super mad in Iceland, naturally, because this caused our krona, or Icelandic currency, or
Mm-hmm.
ISK, to crash massively, devaluing like 80% in a couple of weeks, and the housing market collapsed, and all of these problems that led to like really big socioeconomic problems for a tiny country. So the country, I mean, Icelanders were angry. The government was like, we need to figure out what happened. And then all these evidence, or at least uh, indications of potential market manipulation, started uh, to come out of these crashes. And that's when the government decided to set up this task force called the Special Prosecutor's Office.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where I was working when Hilmar found me and
How
pulled me over
many
to CCP.
in a lot of the Western world, games are still kind of like seen as like kind of a joke thing, like you do them for fun and they're for kids or maybe grown men that need to
Yeah.
grow up or whatever. Did you feel, did it feel strange to go to go from working for something that's as important and with so much gravity, like a global financial crisis, to go from working on that to like video game related stuff? Did that impact you at all mentally? Did it feel like the work was less important, or do you see it differently, or did people around you see you differently?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Definitely on all accounts. So, for example, my mom and dad,
Mm-hmm.
when I told them that I had left the special prosecutor's office, which was a job that they were really proud that I had,
Mm-hmm.
and they understood really clearly, why I was doing it, because we were trying to make sure stuff like this wouldn't happen again in Iceland. And when I told them that I'd left that job to join, CCP, a video game company, they absolutely did not understand, why I
Yeah, I
did
can
that, and they were
imagine.
like,
Yeah.
just like, why? And they asked me like why for weeks, and then I invited them to the CCP offices in Iceland, which are really nice, and we take really good care of our employees. So there's like, like most gaming companies have, they have like game rooms, and and like giant fish tanks and this type of stuff. And my parents walked through it, and at the end of the tour, my dad hadn't said a word. He was like, "You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of when I took you to Disneyland." And so that was like his way of saying like, okay, I get why you left, the special prosecutor's office.
Hmm.
But for me personally, the first project I worked on was we had developed a massive uh, we had developed like a underground economy relating to gambling that was becoming a problem in the game, and that the player community was increasingly pushing us to do something about. And I was very relevant to the job that I've been done before, because
Hmm.
it meant like you had to trace, follow the money, understand what was happening, and
When you say gambling, so my understanding when I played Eve was there were these like third party websites that you could send ISK
yeah,
to and gamble to. Are you talking about these types of sites?
yeah, exactly. That's
Okay.
exactly what's happening. So basically, you were playing in the game. Uh, you could join. Find a corporation in Eve and give them cash,
Hmm.
deposit cash to them, and then they would deposit that cash as credit in these third-party gambling websites, and then you could go there, play, and if you would win something, you would send a banker in that corp that you wanted a payout, and then they had like a delivery service where they would deliver your ship or ISK or whatever it was, depending on what you were gambling with.
Hmm.
And this sort of slowly grew until it was had reached the size where the gambling corp at the time was becoming the richest players in the game, and they were starting to influence the game. and
Hmm.
and of course this wasn't fair, because they were becoming rich using a mechanism that wasn't accessible to other players. So we were looking into this, but anyways,
At the
to
time,
to answer.
just real,
Yeah.
I'm curious at the time. So Eve has kind of an interesting position on scamming, whereas like a lot of games, if you scam people in game, it's bad. You usually get banned for it. But in Eve, or at least up until
Yeah.
I left, you were actively maybe not encouraged to scam people, but it was a big part of the community. In terms of like depositing cash outside of the game to like win ISK prizes, is this something that's like explicitly against your terms of service, or was it a gray area, or how did you guys view that at the time?
I mean, gambling is just prohibited in the EULA,
Mm-hmm.
and scamming is fine by us. I mean, for us, it's just like we create a socioeconomic system, or we create a world with resources, and what you guys want to do with that world is between you guys. So if Destiny gives Trihex a contract for something, and then he bails on it, that's not our problem, and that's not how we view it. It's not our job to then come in and punish you,
Mm-hmm.
unless that scamming involves, you're breaking something. You're like using bots, or you're using elicited third party licenses. But to get back to your question, because you were asking me like how
Yeah.
I felt moving between jobs after sort of I did that job, which was super interesting. I didn't feel a sense of purpose in kind of doing this, and I went to Hilmar and my boss at the time, our previous executive producer, Siegel, and I told them like, hey, I'm not sure I have a strong purpose working for a gaming company, and I was actually thinking about leaving. And then they both told me the same thing. They were like, oh, hold on, wait for FanFest. Like, don't make a decision before FanFest. And FanFest is a yearly festival that we have in Iceland, where all the major players and the hardcore fans fly to Iceland, and they have like a 4 day weekend together, and it's like a super big party. And I'd heard about FanFest. I mean, everybody in Iceland has it. It's such a huge thing here. So I was like, okay, FanFest was a couple of months away, and I was like, I'll give this a couple of months, but I don't understand why a party would change my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But then I went to FanFest, and I met the the veteran community and the community of the game. And when they were telling me about Eve, it was like they were talking about their infant son. It was so important to them, and they glowed when they were talking about their experience and friends they'd made. And I was like, I've never experienced anything like this in a video game. What is going on here? There's something here that I'm missing. And after 4 days of spending time with these people, I was like, these people are experiencing something amazing, something that's incredibly important to their lives, and I don't get it. And and whatever I will contribute to this world of EVE Online is going to have a tremendous impact and consequences for the lives of these couple 100,000 people that populate our socioeconomic system.
Mm-hmm.
So there I started to find my purpose for working for Eve, and that actually led to a long-term research, uh, which was understanding why people seem to develop such massively strong bonds in the game and create such deep, meaningful friendships. And today that has become absolutely my purpose in the game, is to contribute to that, because in a time where loneliness is an epidemic, basically 40% of all people 16 to 27 years old say they're lonely, and 30% in the age groups above. Eve seems to offer something which is like tangible, meaningful connections, and that's where I found my purpose in moving between these very different areas.
Okay, that's cool. What
Wow.
yeah.